In the early 1930s, Japan was changing fast. Factories hummed with new energy, and the military dreamed of machines that could match their ambition. In the dim hangars of Tokyo's army arsenal, engineers huddled over sketches of a small tank. They called it the Hago. It wasn't built for brute strength. It was built for speed. The designers imagined it racing across open plains, its engine humming like a steady heartbeat. The world powers were building heavy machines, slow, thick, powerful, but Japan had other plans. They wanted something light, fast, and clever. When the first prototype rolled onto the testing ground, the soldiers watching fell silent. The Hago moved gracefully across the rough terrain, its tracks clattering but steady. It turned sharply, climbed uneven slopes, and darted through obstacles as if it were alive. For the officers, it was a moment of pride. A machine born from Japanese hands, defying expectations. Inside, though, the tank was cramped. The crew of 3 had little room to breathe. The gunner crouched behind a 37mm cannon, small but efficient. The driver gripped the controls, feeling every vibration from the diesel engine behind him. The commander peered through narrow vision slits, knowing that in battle, those few inches could mean life or death. Despite the discomfort, the soldiers admired its agility. The Hago could reach 45 kilometers per hour, a remarkable speed for its time. It didn't carry much armor, only about 12 millimeters at its thickest point. But in those early days, the designers believed speed and surprise were the best armor of all. During the trials, the officers watched as the Hago raced through muddy fields and rocky paths without stalling once. When it stopped, the engine purred quietly as if pleased with itself. Reports from the trials called it reliable, fast, and easy to maneuver. That was enough to convince the high command. In 1935, after months of debate and redesigns, the Type 95 Hago was officially adopted. Production began the following year. Assembly lines in Osaka and Manchuria echoed with the sound of hammers and rivets. The smell of oil filled the air as young mechanics worked with pride, believing they were building the future of Japan's armored might. But even as the first tanks rolled out of the factories, some officers worried. The armor was thin, too thin, they said. A heavy machine gun could punch through it. Others argued that Japan's enemies wouldn't have such weapons, at least not in Asia. The debates ended when the generals decided that speed and quantity were more important than protection. The Hago was sent to China soon after. For the soldiers who drove it, it was more than a machine. It was a symbol of progress, a sign that Japan could stand equal to the Western powers. The young crews climbed into their tanks with confidence, believing the Hago could carry them to glory. They didn't know yet how fragile that belief would be. The year was 1937. In the smoky dawn above the plains of northern China, the Type 95 Hago rolled forward, its tracks cutting deep into the dust. The Japanese soldiers followed behind, watching their new machine glide across the battlefield. To them, it looked unstoppable. The Hago had proven itself fast and reliable. Against the scattered Chinese forces, it faced little resistance. The enemy's rifles and light guns bounced harmlessly off its thin armor. Machine gun nests were torn apart by the tank's 37mm shells. Villages fell one after another, and every victory added fuel to a growing belief that Japan had mastered modern war. The newspapers back home printed stories of glory. Photographs showed Hago tanks leading charges, their flags fluttering proudly. The headlines called them invincible, a symbol of Japanese engineering and discipline. Young men in Tokyo dreamed of driving one, imagining themselves heroes in steel chariots crossing endless horizons. In reality, the battles were messy and cruel. Dust clung to every bolt and seam. The heat inside the tank turned the crew's breath into steam. Sometimes, when shells struck too close, the thin armor rattled like a drum. But the Hago always moved forward. It became the spearhead of Japan's advance, pushing through roads and rice fields that seemed to go on forever. Inside the tank, life was a strange mix of pride and fear. The driver felt every tremor of the ground. The gunner kept his hands on the shell, ready to load. The commander gave short, calm orders, pretending not to notice his pounding heart. Every battle ended the same way: silence, smoke, and the smell of hot metal. When the fighting slowed, mechanics cleaned the tanks and painted over scratches. They named their machines, names like Rising Dragon or Wind Spear, as if giving them souls. The men believed the Hago would protect them, no matter what came next. And for a while it did. Through China, through the jungles of Southeast Asia, the Hago became a legend. In Malaya, it moved like lightning through muddy paths the British never thought tanks could cross. In the Philippines, it outmaneuvered American positions with daring speed. The crews felt untouchable. The tank's diesel engine roared like a promise of victory. Commanders wrote glowing reports to Tokyo. They said the Hago had no equal in Asia. Soldiers cheered as the tanks rolled by, their hulls dusted with mud and victory. Japan's armored force, once small and uncertain, was now confident, proud, and dangerously sure of itself. But confidence can be blinding. Somewhere deep in Manchuria, whispers began to spread among the officers. Rumors of a new Soviet tank, faster, heavier, deadlier, were reaching the front. A few veterans remembered how fragile the Hago felt when enemy shells hit too close. They warned their superiors. The warnings were ignored. For now, Japan was still winning, and the empire was growing. The Hago was the star of every parade, the shining proof that Japan could conquer any terrain and any enemy. No one knew that its greatest test was waiting far away, on the windswept border where the steppes met the desert. By late 1938, the war in China had turned into a long, grinding campaign. Cities rose and fell under the sound of artillery, and still, the Type 95 Hago pressed forward. Across dusty plains and crumbling villages, the small tanks rolled in columns, their engines coughing black smoke as they advanced through the chaos. The Hago had become a familiar sight on the battlefield, a symbol of Japanese power and determination. Against the Chinese forces, its weaknesses hardly mattered. The enemy rarely had anti-tank weapons strong enough to pierce even the Hago's thin armor. For most battles, the tank's speed and surprise were enough to decide the outcome. In one small town near Hankow, a platoon of Hagos raced down narrow streets, their treads crushing wooden carts and walls alike. The commander stood half out of the turret, waving his sword and shouting orders through the noise. Behind him, infantry ran in his wake, taking cover behind the tanks as they pushed forward. Machine gun fire sparked against the Hago's hull, but the bullets bounced off like rain. The tank's cannon roared, tearing through enemy defenses one by one. When the battle ended, the ground was quiet except for the sound of the engines cooling. The crew climbed out, drenched in sweat and dust, their faces split between exhaustion and pride. The tank had done its job. It had brought victory again. Each success fed the growing myth that Japan's tanks were unstoppable. Officers began to speak of the Hago as if it were a living creature, quick, fearless, and loyal. Soldiers told stories of tanks crossing rivers, climbing steep hills, and bursting through enemy lines like thunder. The truth was often less glamorous, but the legend was powerful, and it spread faster than reality ever could. In the barracks, mechanics shared quiet jokes about the tank's quirks. They knew the armor was thin, the interior cramped, and the ride unbearable on rough ground. But they also knew it rarely broke down. In the mud and rain of China, reliability mattered more than comfort. The Hago was stubborn. It kept moving when others would have stopped. At night, when the front went silent, tank crews slept beside their machines. They leaned against the cold metal, listening to the ticking of the engine as it cooled. Some believed their tank had a spirit, a guardian presence that watched over them. They whispered thanks to it before sleeping, never realizing how fragile that faith really was. By 1939, Japan controlled vast territories in China. The empire seemed unstoppable, and its army believed that their tanks could face anything. When orders came for a new deployment, a border operation near Mongolia, the crews were confident. The mission sounded simple: a quick strike against Soviet-backed forces causing trouble along the frontier. The Hagos were loaded onto trains heading north. The soldiers laughed and smoked, talking about how they would crush the Soviets just like they had crushed everyone else. None of them had ever faced tanks from the Red Army before. None of them imagined how different the next battle would be. The wind on the Mongolian plain was sharp and dry. It carried dust that stung the eyes and filled every crack of the tank's armor. The Hagos rolled out from their trains and into a land that stretched flat and endless. It was a place that tested every machine and every man. The stage was set for the first real challenge Japan's tanks would ever face. The summer of 1939 burned hot across the Mongolian borderlands. The wind never stopped, dragging long trails of dust across the plains. It was a strange place for war, wide, empty, and endless. There were no jungles to hide in, no cities to take cover behind, only open land that stretched to the horizon. And into that emptiness rolled Japan's Type 95 Hago tanks. Their engines growled low as they moved in formation. The crews were confident. They had faced everything from machine gun fire to artillery and had always come out on top. The Soviet soldiers, they thought, would be no different. Their orders were clear: push the border, punish the enemy, and return home victorious. But the men didn't know what waited for them on the other side of the steppe. The first skirmishes began quietly. Japanese patrols spotted flashes of movement far ahead, shapes glinting in the sun, too fast and too large to be trucks. Then came the roar of engines, deeper and louder than anything they had heard before. Out of the haze came Soviet BT tanks, sleek and powerful, their turrets swinging like predators hunting prey. The Hago crews reacted instantly. Guns loaded. Engines roared. Shells flew across the open field, cutting thin trails of smoke in the air. The Japanese tanks fired first, but the 37mm rounds bounced harmlessly off the Soviets' armor. The BT tanks returned fire, and within seconds, the difference was clear. The Hagos, light and fast, were not built for this. A single Soviet shell tore through the side of a Hago, lighting it up in a burst of orange flame. Another struck the turret of a second tank, sending it spinning to the ground. The air filled with the crack of gunfire and the heavy boom of cannons. Japanese crews tried to maneuver, to use speed as their weapon, but on the open steppe, there was nowhere to hide. For the first time, the Hago was helpless. Its thin armor, once seen as a clever trade-off for agility, became its greatest curse. Machine guns and anti-tank shells ripped through it as if it were paper. Commanders shouted orders through the chaos, trying to regroup, but the Soviets pressed harder. Their tanks were faster, stronger, and fought with terrifying precision. By evening, the battlefield was a graveyard of burning steel. The surviving Hago crews retreated, dragging their crippled machines through the dust. Some tanks had their engines shot out, others had lost their turrets completely. The smell of fuel and smoke hung heavy in the air. That night, in the quiet of the camp, the truth sank in. The Hago wasn't invincible. Against the Soviets, it was outmatched in every way. The men sat in silence, staring at the fires still burning on the horizon. Some refused to speak at all. They had seen comrades vanish in seconds, their tanks turned into twisted wrecks. The reports sent back to Tokyo were cautious. They spoke of unexpected resistance and unfavorable terrain. But the soldiers on the ground knew better. They had seen what modern war looked like, and they understood that Japan's tanks were no longer the future. They were already falling behind. Still, when the orders came to withdraw, they obeyed without question. The empire needed victories, and doubt was not a luxury soldiers could afford. The Hago would fight again, in other lands, against other enemies. But somewhere deep inside, the crews carried the memory of the steppe, the place where their confidence cracked and the myth of invincibility began to fade. When the sun rose over the Pacific in late 1941, the world was at war again. Japan's armies moved like waves across Asia, sweeping through the jungles of Malaya, the islands of the Dutch East Indies, and now the Philippines. The Hago rolled once more, its tracks grinding over rough roads and humid soil, its crews confident that the lessons of the steppe had been left behind. The invasion began before dawn. Rain fell in sheets, turning the dirt roads to slick rivers of mud. The Hago tanks led the advance, engines growling low as they climbed the narrow coastal paths toward American positions. Inside, the crews could hear every creak of metal, every hiss of steam from the hot engines. They were tired but focused. Their orders were simple: move fast, strike hard, and keep pushing forward. Across the field, the enemy waited, American and Filipino soldiers armed with rifles, light artillery, and a new kind of tank, the M3 Stuart. The Hago crews didn't know much about it yet. They thought it would be like the Soviet machines, heavy, slow, easy to outmaneuver. But when the first clash came, they found something far more dangerous. The two tanks met in the open near a small village. The jungle around them echoed with the sound of engines and gunfire. A Hago fired first, its 37mm shell striking the front of the M3 and sparking off harmlessly. The Stuart returned fire a heartbeat later. The shell hit square on the Hago's turret, tearing it open like a tin can. The explosion rolled across the field. The Japanese infantry froze, watching their trusted tank go up in flames. For the first time since China, they saw that their steel protector could be destroyed so easily. But despite the shock, the Japanese didn't stop. The Hagos kept charging through the mud and palm trees, outflanking enemy positions, ambushing convoys, and forcing the Americans to retreat. Their light weight let them cross bridges the Stuarts couldn't. Their small size made them ghosts in the jungle. It wasn't power that won the first battles. It was speed, confusion, and the relentless pressure of an enemy that refused to rest. In the early weeks, victory came quickly. Town after town fell. The Hago crews, exhausted and soaked, barely slept. They pushed their machines until the engines groaned from overuse. Mechanics worked by torchlight, patching bullet holes with scrap metal and welding shattered treads. But the longer the campaign lasted, the clearer the cracks became. The 37mm gun that once seemed sharp now struggled to pierce American armor. The thin plating that made the Hago light now turned it into a trap for its crew. When American planes appeared overhead, the tanks had nowhere to hide. By early 1942, the air was filled with the thunder of bombs. Hagos burned on the roadsides, their hulls still smoking days later. The survivors fought on, hiding in the jungle, using camouflage to survive. Yet even as the Philippines fell, many of the men knew they were fighting a battle they could not sustain. Still, they took pride in their victories. They had fought hard and proven that courage and speed could still win ground, even against stronger machines. The Empire celebrated their success, calling it proof that Japan could conquer the Pacific. But deep down, the tank crews knew the truth. They had seen the future again, and it wasn't theirs. As the last embers of battle died across the Philippine hills, the Hago crews looked toward the sea. Beyond it lay more islands, more battles, and enemies that would grow stronger with every fight. And far across the ocean, in factories that never slept, American engineers were already building something new, machines that would soon change the war completely. By 1943, the tide of war had begun to shift. The Japanese empire stretched wide across the Pacific, but beneath the surface, cracks were spreading. Supply lines were thin. Fuel was scarce. And somewhere deep in the factories of Japan, the clatter of production had slowed to an anxious rhythm. In the workshops where the Hago was once built with pride, the workers now labored under pressure and exhaustion. Bombers roared overhead in the distance, and the sound of air raid sirens had become a daily echo. The young men who used to assemble tanks were gone, drafted into the army or lost in battle. Their places were filled by older hands and young apprentices, still learning how to weld under dim factory lights. On the front lines, the soldiers could feel the change too. The Hagos still fought, still rumbled through the jungle and along the beaches, but it no longer inspired confidence. Reports from Burma and New Guinea told the same story: enemy tanks that could shrug off direct hits, and planes that turned every open road into a death trap. In the Philippines, crews began to reinforce their tanks with makeshift armor. They bolted steel plates scavenged from wrecked vehicles, stacked sandbags along the hull, and even tied logs to the sides for extra protection. It looked desperate, and it was. The Hago was becoming a relic, a machine from another time, pushed to survive in a war that had evolved far beyond it. Back in Tokyo, generals debated endlessly. Some argued for newer designs, heavier tanks with thicker armor and bigger guns. Others insisted that Japan didn't have the industry to build them in large numbers. The Navy still demanded priority, for ships, for planes, for steel, leaving the Army to make do with what it already had. So the Hago stayed in service, even as its age showed. Mechanics fought to keep engines running on limited parts. Diesel oil was mixed with anything that would burn. Crews learned to improvise, to adapt, to survive on ingenuity rather than equipment. In the jungles of the Pacific, morale began to waver. The American advance was relentless, island by island, base by base. Each new battle seemed closer to Japan's heart. Soldiers whispered about the new American tank, the Sherman, a giant compared to their own. Some said its armor could take 3 hits and keep moving. Others claimed its gun could split a Hago in half with a single shot. The rumors reached every camp, and with them came unease. The veterans who had fought in China and the Philippines spoke softly at night, remembering when they had once believed themselves invincible. Now they checked their tanks before every patrol, listening for new rattles in the engine or cracks in the armor. Still, they fought on. For them, honor was not measured in victories but in endurance. The Hago crews became known for their stubbornness, men who would take on impossible odds simply because they had to. They trained to use the terrain, to strike from cover, to ambush and disappear before the enemy could react. But the storm was coming, and they could feel it in the air. The radio crackled with news of lost islands and burning fleets. The empire that once seemed unshakable was beginning to tremble. On a small island chain in the Pacific, soldiers began digging trenches and fortifications. They buried their tanks halfway in the sand, turning them into fixed guns. They knew the Americans were coming soon. The Hago crews checked their ammunition and wiped their guns clean. Some of them wrote letters home, though few would ever be delivered. Above them, the sky was dark with rain and distant thunder. The storm was gathering, and the next island it would strike had a name that every soldier whispered with dread: Saipan. The sea around Saipan was calm the morning the horizon turned black. It wasn't clouds that filled the sky, but ships, hundreds of them. The American fleet stretched as far as the eye could see, their silhouettes merging with the mist. For the Japanese soldiers waiting on the island, the sight was beyond belief. It was as if the ocean itself had risen against them. In their dugouts and bunkers, Hago crews listened to the distant thunder of naval guns. Each blast shook the ground and sent waves of dust down from the cave ceilings. The tanks were hidden in camouflaged pits, some buried up to their turrets. They waited silently, engines cold, their crews clutching helmets and whispering quiet prayers. The bombardment went on for hours. Shells tore through palm trees and bunkers, shredding everything that wasn't buried deep enough. When it finally stopped, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of burning oil. Then, faintly at first, came the sound of engines, hundreds of landing craft moving toward the beaches. The invasion had begun. The Japanese commander on Saipan, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, knew what was coming. The tanks were few, just dozens of Hagos scattered across the island, but they were all he had. His orders were simple and final: fight to the last man. When night fell, the counterattack began. One by one, the Hagos started their engines. The sound echoed across the ridges like a growl. Their headlights stayed dark as they rolled through the jungle, guided only by the moonlight and the flicker of distant fires. Inside the tanks, the crews gritted their teeth, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. They knew what awaited them: Sherman tanks, bazookas, and machine guns powerful enough to pierce their armor like paper. But they went anyway. As the tanks broke through the treeline, the Americans opened fire. Tracer rounds stitched the night sky, and the air exploded with the sound of .50 caliber guns. The first Hago burst into flames before it had even fired a shot. Another kept moving, its tracks glowing red as bullets tore through its hull. One crew managed to get within range of a Sherman. The gunner fired point blank, the shell slamming into the American tank's front armor with a sharp clang. The Sherman didn't even slow down. Its turret turned smoothly, and a single shot blew the Hago apart. All across the field, similar scenes unfolded. The Japanese tanks fought fiercely, weaving through palm groves and coral ridges, firing until their ammunition was gone. Some crews tried desperate tricks, charging downhill at full speed, ramming enemy vehicles, or using smoke from burning wrecks as cover. A few tanks even made it into the American lines, scattering infantry before being destroyed. By dawn, the battlefield was covered in the wreckage of steel. 31 Hagos lay in pieces across the fields and beaches. Some were still burning, sending black columns of smoke into the pale morning light. The survivors stumbled through the chaos, dazed and silent. They had done everything they could, and it hadn't been enough. American Marines walked among the wrecks later that day, studying the shattered tanks. They were surprised by how light and thin the Japanese armor was. Some joked that even their rifles could have punched holes through it. Others just stared quietly, realizing how desperate the defense must have been. For the Japanese crews, there was no comfort left. Those who survived knew they had faced an enemy that outclassed them in every way. Their tanks, once symbols of national pride, were now twisted husks scattered across the island like broken promises. The Battle of Saipan was not over yet, but for Japan's armored force, it was the beginning of the end. The island had become a graveyard of steel, a silent monument to the courage of men who fought with machines already doomed. The days after the first battle were unlike anything the Japanese had faced before. The air never stopped trembling. Planes circled overhead from dawn to dusk, dropping bombs that tore open the earth and left nothing untouched. The once green hills of Saipan had turned gray and lifeless, a landscape of ash and metal. The survivors of the tank battalions hid what remained of their machines in caves and behind shattered ridges, waiting for orders that never came. The Hago tanks that still worked were ghosts now. Their paint was scorched, their tracks bent and patched. Mechanics scavenged parts from wrecks, pulling gears and bolts with bare hands under the watchful eyes of enemy aircraft. Every sound, even the creak of a wrench, felt like a risk. The Americans ruled the sky, and every open space meant death. At night, the survivors moved like shadows. They rolled the Hagos down dirt paths, engines off, guided only by moonlight. When they reached their positions, they would start the engines for a brief moment, adjust their aim, and then wait. The tanks no longer fought in daylight. They were hunters in the dark now, striking at the edges of American lines, firing once or twice before slipping back into the blackness. One night, a small unit of Hagos ambushed a convoy of Shermans near a burnt-out sugar field. The Japanese fired from close range, their shells clanging off thick armor but managing to cripple one of the lead tanks by hitting its tracks. For a brief moment, the Americans scattered, unsure of where the shots had come from. Then the sky lit up with return fire. The ground shook as shells slammed into the fields, tearing the Hagos apart. When the smoke cleared, only one of the Japanese tanks was still moving, its gun barrel bent, its engine howling like a wounded animal. For the men inside, it no longer felt like war. It felt like survival. Every breath was a gift. Every explosion, a reminder that the island was shrinking around them. The American forces advanced day by day, their tanks pushing deeper into the island, their air power striking anything that dared to move. The Marines had learned quickly how to deal with Japanese armor. Heavy machine guns, bazookas, even grenades shoved into engine vents, anything could kill a Hago now. One Marine squad discovered a tank still running, its crew already dead inside. They stood in silence, listening to the faint hum of the diesel engine, as if the machine itself refused to admit defeat. Then they shut it down and walked away. For the Japanese crews still alive, there was no retreat. Many turned their tanks into bunkers, burying them halfway in the ground with only the gun exposed. Some filled them with explosives, waiting for the moment to detonate when American tanks came close. Others simply sat inside, rifles in their laps, staring through the narrow vision slits at a world that was collapsing. The heat, the noise, and the endless bombardment wore them down. When the Americans dropped flares at night, the island glowed like daylight. There was nowhere left to hide. The sky itself seemed to fall upon them, one explosion at a time. By the end of June, Saipan was a wasteland of twisted metal and burned-out tanks. The last of the Hagos were either destroyed or buried under rubble. The few remaining crews fought on foot, carrying rifles instead of shells. They moved among the ruins of their machines, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes hollow but unbroken. When the final counterattack came, it wasn't led by tanks or artillery. It was led by men, barefoot, bloodied, charging with bayonets and grenades in their hands. The tanks had done all they could. Now, it was the soldiers' turn to meet their end. The sky over Saipan glowed red for 3 days straight. And when it finally cleared, nothing moved. When the smoke finally lifted over Saipan, there was only silence. The beaches that had once echoed with gunfire were now scattered with burned tanks, broken weapons, and the unending smell of diesel and ash. The once proud Hago battalions were gone. What remained of them were rusting shells, half buried in sand, their turrets twisted toward the sea. For the American soldiers walking through the wreckage, the sight was strange. They had expected mighty machines, but what they found looked small, almost fragile. Some Marines poked at the thin armor with their knives, surprised at how easily it bent. Others climbed onto the hulls, shaking their heads in disbelief. They realized then that their enemies had gone to battle with almost no chance of survival. In the days after the fighting ended, captured Japanese tankers were brought from the caves and ruins where they had hidden. Many were wounded, their uniforms torn and faces covered in soot. They looked at the wrecked Hagos scattered across the fields and said nothing. For them, the silence of the tanks was unbearable. Those machines had been their pride, their shield, and their last connection to hope. Now they were nothing but tombs. The American interrogators asked questions about the tanks, about the armor, the guns, the engines. But most of the captured crews didn't answer. When they finally spoke, their words came slowly, full of disbelief. They said they had been told their tanks could withstand anything. They had believed the Empire's promises. On Saipan, they learned how wrong those promises were. Some of the tankers wept openly. Others just stared at the ground, whispering the names of their comrades who had never made it out of their burning machines. They were not cowards or fools, just soldiers who had trusted too much in what they were given. Back in Japan, the news of Saipan spread like wildfire. Official reports spoke of heroism and sacrifice, but those who read between the lines understood the truth. Japan's armored forces had been crushed. Factories still built Hagos because they had nothing else to build, but even the workers knew that each new tank would be little more than an offering to inevitability. The Empire tried to adapt. Engineers worked late into the night sketching designs for heavier tanks, thicker armor, stronger guns. But the reality was cruel. Japan's industry simply couldn't keep up. Steel was scarce. Fuel was scarcer. Every ship carrying supplies risked being sunk before it reached its destination. In the Pacific, the Americans kept coming. First Guam, then Leyte, then Iwo Jima. Each battle brought new waves of Sherman tanks, each one stronger and more refined than the last. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Where Japan's tanks creaked and sputtered, the American machines purred, supported by endless lines of spare parts, fuel, and manpower. For the men who once drove the Hago, defeat was not just a loss of ground. It was a loss of faith. They had believed that skill and courage could make up for steel and numbers. On Saipan, they learned that courage alone could not stop progress. Some surviving tankers were reassigned to infantry units. Others became instructors, training new recruits who would never see a proper tank again. In the barracks, they spoke quietly about the war, about how it had changed from one of honor to one of survival. At night, they sometimes dreamed of their old machines, the feel of the controls, the vibration of the engine, the smell of oil and metal. In those dreams, the Hago still moved, still carried them forward across open plains and muddy rivers. But when they woke, the sound of bombers filled the sky, and they knew that world was gone. The echo of defeat was everywhere. In the silence of the factories, in the empty streets of bombed cities, and in the hearts of men who had seen too much. Yet even then, they prepared for what came next. The Empire had not surrendered, not yet. The war would go on, but for Japan's tanks, the end was already written. The final months of the war felt like the closing of a long and terrible story. Japan's cities burned under endless waves of bombers, and the once proud empire was shrinking with every battle lost. The sound of engines that once symbolized progress now meant only destruction. In hidden workshops deep in the mountains, the last Type 95 Hago tanks were still being built. The workers moved quietly, their faces thin, their hands trembling from hunger. There was no steel to spare, no proper tools, and barely enough fuel to test the engines. Yet they worked, driven by duty, or perhaps by the hope that their efforts might still matter. The tanks they finished were outdated before they even left the factory. The same 37mm guns, the same thin armor, the same narrow hulls that had rolled proudly into China a decade earlier. Only now, the world had changed completely. The Americans had Shermans, Pershings, and a supply chain that stretched from one ocean to the other. The Hago was a relic, a whisper from an era that no longer existed. On Okinawa, the last armored units received their orders. Their tanks would not maneuver or charge. They would be buried into hillsides, turned into fixed fortifications. The soldiers covered them with dirt and branches, leaving only the gun barrels exposed. The Hago had become a bunker, a coffin waiting for its time. When the battle came, the sky and sea exploded at once. Naval guns rained shells across the island, and aircraft screamed overhead in endless waves. The buried tanks fired a few desperate shots before being silenced forever. The crews inside never came out. They had become part of the island, part of the ground they were told to defend. Far to the north, on the island of Shumshu, the story ended the same way. The Soviet invasion came fast, catching the defenders off guard. The Hago tanks there were old and worn, their engines coughing black smoke as they tried to climb the rocky slopes. Against Soviet T-34s, they had no chance. Within hours, the ground was littered with burning wrecks. For the soldiers who fought in them, there was no shame. They had done what they could with what they had. The tankers faced overwhelming fire, and still they stayed at their posts. But bravery could not change the balance of power. The world had entered an age where industry, not courage, decided victory. In American factories, assembly lines never stopped. Detroit alone produced more tanks in a single month than Japan did in an entire year. Conveyor belts carried the steel skeletons of Shermans down long, echoing halls where women worked beside men, welding and assembling with fierce precision. Every bolt, every plate, every gear was a piece of a machine that would soon roll into battle. Across the Pacific, Japan's own factories stood silent. Bombed roofs exposed the skeletons of machines that would never run again. The promise of modern war that once filled the empire with pride had turned to dust. When the war finally ended, many of the surviving Hago tanks were left abandoned where they stood. Some were pushed into rivers, others left to rust in the jungle. A few were taken by the Americans as war trophies, displayed in museums as reminders of a time when ambition outpaced ability. And yet, even in defeat, the story of the Hago remained powerful. It was not a story of victory, but of persistence, of men who climbed into fragile machines and faced impossible odds because they believed they must. It was the story of a nation that dreamed too far and paid too much for that dream. Years later, on quiet islands scattered across the Pacific, the skeletons of those tanks still stand. Grass grows through their open hatches, and salt wind eats away at their once shining armor. They are monuments now, not to power, but to the cost of believing that steel alone could shape destiny. The Type 95 Hago began as a symbol of pride and ended as a relic of humility. Its final lesson lay not in the roar of its engine, but in the silence that followed. The Iron Dream had ended,